Big Ideas, Birkbeck's free public lecture series where academics bring their research out to local communities around London, sharing the exciting and innovative work that happens at Birkbeck and opening up the world of research and university. The series is organised by Birkbeck's Access and Engagement team, who support underrepresented groups of people to apply and succeed here at Birkbeck, University of London. This podcast will introduce you to the upcoming talks in the Big Ideas series. Our researchers will give you a preview of what's in store and hopefully entice you along to the event. If you like what you hear today and want to come along, you can find the details in the web link in the description of the podcast. We'd love to see you there. Today I am joined by Naomi Smith, a postgraduate research student in journalism at Birkbeck. She's here to introduce us to her research ahead of her talk in Stratford in April. The talk is entitled Big Ideas, How Do Journalists Decide What Is or Isn't News? Hi.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm really looking forward to your talk in Newham in Stratford Library. So can you tell me a little bit about what your research is about?
Sure. So at the most simple level, it's about how journalists decide what is or isn't a news story. So what's going to make it onto the television, what's going to make it into a newspaper. And I'm coming at it specifically from an intersectional point of view, which is looking at how those decisions are influenced by identity. So the identity of the people who are making the news, who are deciding what stories to record, to share with the public, are deciding what those stories are going to be about, how they are framed, who they talk about, who they talk to, who they interview. And so how the identities of those journalists, but also the identities of the people they're talking about, how they impact on what stories are chosen and how those stories are framed. And I'm doing that by creating a series of case studies looking at specific stories that have been covered by specifically American television news networks over time. So essentially over the last 30 years. The furthest I'm going back is literally like a year after I was born. So it's a useful way of measuring it. And I'm doing this, through an intersectional framework, in part because that allows me to bring together both the identities of, as I say, the people inside of newsrooms and the people they're talking about, but also with the overarching systems. Because one of the things that's emphasized by intersectionality is that identity is important, but it's only as important as the systems in which we exist and the way that those systems understand and frame identity. Because your race wouldn't matter if you didn't live within a system where race is important. Your gender wouldn't matter if you lived inside a system where gender isn't important. So that lets you bring together like the sort of professional systems that journalists are in, the socioeconomic or political climate of the day, and the sort of, the business framework. Like newsrooms are a business, so that is an important factor as well. With this question of, who is doing this and why are they doing it? And that really allows us to go one step further from the research that has already been done, essentially. Because this is really something that goes back to the 1950s. Like, people have been asking this question, like, who decides what is a story and how do they do it, for decades. Like, there's a lot of literature on this. So the main theory that people tend to use is just a sort of list of things that a story has to have. So it's got to be bad news, it's got to have recognizable people that the audience is going to know, it's got to be from the geographical area that they know, that kind of thing. And it's just a list of things, and it's sort of, well, if it meets I don't know, 5 of these things out of 10, then it's more likely to become a news story. And I sort of looked at that and went, well, okay, that makes a certain amount of sense. But that original piece of work that we all start from was done it was done a few decades ago in Norway, I think, predominantly white country, and looking at just newspapers, just national newspapers, and possibly even more crucially, they were what are called peace researchers. So they look at war and they look at conflict. So they had looked specifically at just stories about these few conflicts that were happening at the time. And then we just run with that and gone, well, this is how news is collected, and just like improved upon that over the years. And I sort of thought, well, okay, but what if we question that initial assumption? Because we're assuming that we can take this one way of looking at things and generalize it to every country in the world. Every kind of, like, they didn't have digital media. That wasn't a thing. There were no, newspaper websites. And so I sort of thought, well, how might they like that have changed if they'd been working in Africa, or they'd been working in China, or somewhere in South America, for example? How might, I know, a woman in Nigeria do things differently to a man in Norway? Because we would have been talking about men at that point. It would have been pretty much solely white men. So that was where I started.
I think it's really interesting. One of the first things you said is that, it's kind of a question as old as time. But I think now, because we're sort of in this age of constant media and constant access to media and 24-hour news cycles, that we feel like it's really current. And I think that's probably a theme throughout all our big ideas, is that we tend to feel like we are suddenly being affected by these topics when actually they've been going on for a really long time. So that's just really interesting. What would you like people to take away from this talk? What do you think will really surprise people?
So one of the sort of questions that's always come up for me is what the difference between what journalists think they do and what researchers think journalists do, and then what the public thinks journalists do.
That is interesting.
Because I'm looking at the end product and then sort of reverse engineering conclusions about what that means people are doing. And that's the same thing that audiences are doing. So I think something they'd be surprised about is probably the way in which we think about how news is chosen. Because I think there is a disconnect between how the general public perceives it and how the people actually doing the work and doing the research about the work see it. So I think that's something that I generally assume people will be surprised about. But I think the thing that I really want people to take away from it is, firstly, one of the useful things about intersectionality as a theory is the way it changes the way that you look at things and the way you think about things, because it gives you this much more nuanced framework for talking about stuff. Whatever it might be, not just, journalism, but, anything, because it combines the individual and the system. So I think that sort of just thinking about how that framework applies just in your general life, I think, and the way that you think about things, I would hope that would be something people would take away. But also the reason why this kind of research is important, because at the end of the day, without the audience for media, it really has no significance. If journalists are just shouting into the void, then it doesn't really matter what they say. And so the reason that the research is important, or I like to think it's important, is because what journalists are saying, it does have an effect on people. We have this tendency to, I think, blame a lot of things on the media. But, and that's not always true. It's not always a useful way of looking at things. But it is true that what journalists say, how they say it, who they let speak, because that's one of the things that I'm looking at, is who gets to speak, how long do they get to speak for, who's asking the questions as well, because that's going to impact not just what the story is, but how it's framed. Like, is it, is it a negative story? Is it a positive story? Is it critical about one group or another group? Because you could tell that exact same story and have the message from it be a completely different thing. So it's important because of the impact that it has on people and on audiences. And I think that's useful generally to not just to researchers and not just journalists to think about, but the general public as well. Because if you're thinking about these things, you're starting to build this toolkit for understanding media while you're consuming it, while you're watching it.
Really important.
Yeah. And just being able to, if you're watching the news and you start thinking, well, when I was at that lecture, they said that this is maybe why they might be choosing to do this. And coming at it from almost an analytical viewpoint rather than just, sort of, I don't like what they're saying.
It's critical. It makes you think.
Yeah, exactly. And, I hope that it will, just get people started thinking about that, because you don't have to be a media analyst to, be able to watch the news critically and say, oh, well, this is why they're saying this. So I'm going to take this away from it. I'm going to take this nuanced conclusion away from it. And hopefully that allows people to, hopefully better understand what they're hearing and be able to, use that information in ways that are helpful to them.
Amazing. Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing more and hearing the talk in full. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.